Hey guys, welcome back to All Cooking and No BS, where I mostly BS and sometimes we cook. Today, I want to show you one of my favorites. This is something I've been making for a long time. Let's not disclose exactly how long because I've been making it since I was a teenager. These are my homemade spicy pork meatballs. Homemade meatballs are incredibly easy to make, and in reality, they're just so much better than anything that you can buy in the store that there's no good reason not to make it. Now, I'm going to show you today how to start with actual big chunks of meat, but you could absolutely use pre-ground meat if you wanted to, although I will say that I don't think it makes quite as tender of a meatball. So let's walk through these ingredients really quick, and I've labeled them to make it a little bit easier for you here to keep track of what's going on. So on my right, I have beef, and I realize that that sounds weird because I just told you these were pork meatballs, but in reality, they're a mix of different things. This is beef short rib. I also have pork shoulder over here, and this is full fat. This is just a nice chunk off of it, half a pound of each of these. Down here, I have some onions and garlic. I like to use a white onion for this because it's very, very spicy. In the middle, I have some basic pork salami. This is a Genoa style or just a sweet salami. I have some dried herbs, and I have some fresh parsley. Now, we got to break this down, but we're going to mix all of this together and then run it through our meat grinder all at once. Add in a couple more ingredients, get these things in a pan and cook them. And we're going to have meatballs on the table ready to go in under an hour. So let's get started. So let's take our beef here and let's just cut it into chunks small enough to run through our grinder. So they don't have to be huge. They don't have to be tiny either. Something to the effect of, 1 to 2 inch pieces is perfectly fine. And let's just toss those over here in our bowl. All right, we'll do the same with our pork shoulder here. Again, we want to keep all of this fat. We're intentionally using fatty and tough cuts of meat here. The reason being that, well, they just taste a lot better than the lean counterparts. Meatballs is not a place where you want to start using lean meat. This is definitely an area where you're looking to blend some fat in there to keep that moisture in place and also just to increase the flavor content. So, again, dicing these up in roughly that same size piece, call it inch and a half. Tossing that over here in our mixing bowl. All right, so we have our meat in there. Let's go ahead and add some other ingredients. Now, inside here, these are my dried herbs. And I know I wasn't very specific about that, but I have a mix of the things that I like in my meatballs. So that's marjoram, dried rosemary, dried oregano. I even have a little bit of sage in here as well because I like that flavor profile. In reality, you could use anything that you wanted. You could use just oregano or you could put basil in it if you wish. This is an area where you can play with it a lot. Now, one thing I don't add to this is fennel seed, and you'll see why in a few minutes, but let's sprinkle this over, and it's a decent amount here. I probably have, about a tablespoon, 1 heaping tablespoon of dried herbs, which might seem a bit much, but they kind of blend into the sauce as time goes on. So, now, I also have some salami. Now, I'm lazy about this and I buy the pre-sliced Genoa salami, out of the little butcher's case. You could 100% get a stick of salami and cut it up. What I find, though, is that the really thin slices work through your grinder a lot better. The thicker pieces, if you were to run salami the same size as the meat, it'll get caught in your grinder. So, just kind of cut it into smaller pieces to make it easier to run through and toss this in. Now, I like the flavor of the salami in here. It brings some fat, but it also brings a tanginess to it from the fact that it's a cured meat. And for me, that's a big differentiating factor in these meatballs. I think it's one of the things that makes them have a more well-rounded flavor to them. So I wouldn't omit this if I was you, but it's not the end of the world if you can't find it to put it in there. All right. Some garlic cloves here. I don't really need to do anything to these. I can just kind of make sure that they don't have any of the little nubbies on the end of it and then just chuck them in the bowl because we'll run the garlic cloves through the grinder and that'll chop them up. Perfect. Now, my onion I do need to cut down a little bit just because it's too big. So I'm going to cut it into pieces, again, roughly the size of the meat. We'll call it 1.5 inches, give or take. And then we'll toss these over here in the bowl as well. And then finally, I have a couple more ingredients. I have some parsley leaves, which I have right here. And I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to kind of throw them in here. Again, it sounds crazy, but we'll run these through the grinder and they'll come out just fine. And then obviously, I need to add some salt and some pepper to this. Now, how much? Well, that's always a guessing game here. I find that you can always add more, but you can't take it away. So what I'm going to start with is 1 big pinch of salt and then 8, 9, 10 grinds of black pepper. Mix this all up. and I'm gonna pop it in my fridge. I want this to be nice and cold before I start grinding it. In the meantime, I can grab my other ingredients for making these meatballs. I almost forgot our secret ingredient. It's this right here. This is fennel. This is bulb fennel. So the seed that you're accustomed to seeing, you know, on pizza and stuff like that, that's part of this as well. It's like literally when it goes to seed. This is sort of the vegetable portion of it, if you want to think of it like that, and this is the herb portion of fennel. And these have a much more mild flavor than the seeds themselves do, and I prefer that in a meatball personally, so that it doesn't kind of get that, I don't know, Italian sausage flavor. So let's add some of this to it. Now, it has a core in the inside right here, and that's not very pleasant, so just grab your knife and cut the core out by kind of making a little V cut here. Pull that out, chuck that aside. And then I'm just gonna go back and I'm gonna cut straight through this, the tops, everything. And I'm not gonna use the whole thing, that would be really, really strong. But a decent amount of the herb portion here, and then I'm also gonna go over here and I'm gonna cut up just a little bit of the vegetable bottom portion of this as well. And we'll run all this through with our meat. And then we'll have a really great meatball. Speaking of other ingredients, what are those other ingredients? Well, it's what we got in front of us right here. And these actually might be the most important ingredients for making a fantastic, super melt-in-your-mouth meatball. And it's bread, milk, and eggs. I know that seems contrarian because in a lot of ways you think, well, more meat makes a better meatball. But in reality, more bread makes a better meatball because this stuff right here keeps it nice and tender. And the milk and the eggs creates a binder. The technique, from the French perspective at least, is called panade, and it's literally just that. It's normally flour and milk and eggs, but I think that making it out of actual baked bread, especially really soft bread, produces the absolute best meatball. So I'm gonna crack my eggs in my milk, give that a whisk up, and then I'm gonna tear this bread up into little small pieces. So let's do that. We'll have it all ready to go before we start grinding our meat. The grinder we're going to use today is just your basic KitchenAid grinder that attaches to a mixer. If this was a lot of meat and we needed to process, I don't know, 20, 30 pounds, we would definitely have to step it up to something bigger, but this is only about a pound of meat, so this should be relatively easy. I have the biggest die in there. That's the one with the big holes, by the way. So you'll see it kind of makes a coarse grind, and I keep this entire apparatus in my freezer when I'm not using it because cold grinder, cold blade, cold die, cold parts makes for an emulsified ground meat when it's coming out. So that's important. Remember that. Keep this thing in your freezer. That's the best place to store it. So let's get started. We're going to go with the mixer on full speed. Probably going to be annoying and noisy. So I'm going to stop talking and just grind this meat. Our meat mixture is ground up, and this is what it looks like. So you can see all the flecks of different stuff here. Now, we need this to get mixed together, but remember that we still have our bread, which we're just gonna go ahead and add to this bowl here. And this, you'll notice, there's a little bit of the outside, but I try to make sure that if there's any parts of the outside that are really tough or really dry, I just kind of pitch those to the side. We also have our 2 eggs right here, and about a half a cup of milk. So let's add that. And you know what? In reality, I'm going to stop there and give it a mix up first and see because, again, we can always add a little bit more to it. Now, as far as seasonings are concerned, we already have some salt and pepper in here, but I do have one other ingredient that I'd like to add to it. Let me grab it for you real quick. This stuff right here. Worcestershire sauce, Worcestershire, you know, whatever. You guys know what it is. Super flavorful. This is your umami bomb, and you always want some of that in here. So I don't know, 8, 9, 10 shakes, not aggressive shakes of Worcestershire in there. And now, let's give it a mix up. You could use a spoon. I find that the best tool is your hand, specifically one with a glove on it, because it's kind of weird if you don't put a glove on. So, let's do that. Let's give it a good mix up so everything is emulsified. And then I'm going to take this mixture and I'm going to put it back in my fridge and I'm going to let it sit for 1 hour. That's before I shape it. Otherwise, it's just, I don't know, it's kind of a globby mess. So that cooling for about an hour is nice. We'll get cleaned up. We'll get the rest of our ingredients together. So give it a mix. So it's been an hour and our meatballs are now ready. Matter of fact, I went ahead and took the opportunity to shape them into little balls. I didn't feel like you guys needed to see that because honestly, the size and shape of it is irrelevant. Make them as big or as small as you prefer them to be. Just try to consider how you're going to serve them. For me, I tend to just serve the meatballs by themselves, oftentimes with just maybe some warm bread to dunk in there. That's just my preferred method. They're great over polenta. Obviously, you could go the whole, kind of Italian-American route and go spaghetti and meatballs if you wanted to, and in which case they're probably a little bit big for that. But go ahead and shape them out. In my case, I ended up with 11. Probably would have been cool if there was 12, but whatever. I have 11 meatballs, and I'm going to start browning them. So in my pan here, and this, by the way, is kind of a heavy cast iron pan, but it's enameled. So there's a reason for that. We're going to be adding tomatoes to this. And I would never add tomatoes to an uncoated cast iron pan because they will, the acidity will react with the pan and they'll taste terrible. But the enamel will prevent that from being an issue. So let's start browning our meatballs. Try to get them as even as possible. I'm using clarified butter for this because I like the taste of it. It could be vegetable oil. It could even be olive oil if necessary. So let's get them in the pan. So in our pan that we browned our meatballs in, I've added about, quarter of a cup of red wine vinegar. I've added 1 can of San Marzano tomatoes that I've crushed up in my hands. I've added 1 big tablespoon of hot chilies. In my case, that's Calabrian chilies. If you're using chili flakes, I would just use 1 pinch. And then I've added about a quarter of a cup of beef broth. So I've given that a stir up here, brought it up to a boil. And I just want to taste it really quickly. Needs a little bit of seasoning. I'm going to add 1 pinch of salt to this, which let me grab. Sitting too far off camera. 1 pinch of salt, maybe 1.5 pinches of salt, call it that. And then I'm going to add my meatballs back to this. Just get them coated in the sauce, pop the lid on it, and then I'm going to put it in my oven, 350 degrees for 40 minutes. All right, 40 minutes. So just took it out of the oven. This is going to be super, super hot, by the way. But let's pull it off, just take a look at it. Oh, man. That looks fantastic. Just kind of, you could touch the meatballs, and if they spring back, like the minute you touch them, if they kind of bounce back, that means they're done, and these definitely are. Now, this is the tricky part. I feel like I say this in all my recipes. The challenge here really isn't, are these going to be delicious right now? They will be, but they'll be so much better if we let this cool down. And for me personally, I would prefer to make these and then just leave them out for several hours. Let them cool down on the back of your stove. You know, make them in the morning or in the afternoon and then eat them for dinner that night and just warm them back up. My point is that by cooling in the liquid that they're cooked in and us not taking them out, that's going to make a huge difference to this being like a really fantastic meatball versus one that's pretty good. So I would encourage you to take that opportunity to just let them rest and see this as an opportunity to make them earlier in the day. So that's what I'm going to do, and we're going to come back in about an hour once they have cooled down. I'll cut one open, and we'll see what they look like. So it's been 40 minutes. Easier said than done to wait, but I think it's going to be worth it because these look absolutely fantastic. So let's pull one out and take a look and see if we got that really nice, juicy meatball that we were looking for. By the way, these are still plenty hot. Like, this could be served just like it is. We don't actually need to reheat it at all. Let's cut this thing open and have a look. That looks absolutely beautiful. You can see all the different pieces in here. You can see the bread. You can see the salami and the herbs. And more importantly, it's incredibly tender. Mm. And the seasoning is just right. All of those elements meld together in the sauce. That slow cook, and then most importantly, that resting period makes all the difference in the world. So, guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Come back and see me again soon. I'll make something else for you. Until then, y'all take care.